We're on.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final session in 2021 of the Popular Music Books in Process series, a joint project of IASPM US, the Journal of Popular Music Studies, and the POP Conference. I'm Carl Wilson, one of the series organizers, along with Eric Weisbach and Kimberly Mack. You can find our whole calendar for their upcoming January sessions on the IASPM website under the Journal of Popular Music Studies tab, and get on the mailing list by contacting Eric. And you can also catch up on videos of all of our past sessions on Eric's YouTube channel, including last week's with Melody Lau, Michael Barkley, and Owen Pallett, talking about Tegan and Sarah and the Canadian indie boom of the early 2000s. And I wanted to remind you that the series returns on January 10th with a session called Country Reinventions, featuring Marissa Moss with her upcoming book on women in country, Where Have All the Cowgirls Gone? Stacey Easton with Why Tammy Wynette Matters, and Shauna Golden Perschbacher on queer country. So we'll have that to look forward to over the holidays. But today we're talking about the role of indie labels, with Jessica Lipsky presenting her book, It Ain't Retro, Daptone Records in the 21st Century Soul Revolution, which came out this summer from Jawbone Press in London, and Bill Kopp with his Disturbing the Peace, 415 Records, and the Rise of New Wave, publishing this month with Hozak Books in Chicago. Quick bios on today's authors. Jessica Lipsky is a Brooklyn-based DJ and journalist who primarily writes on the intersection of subculture and popular music. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, NPR, Billboard, Columbia Journalism Review, Public Radio International, Newsweek, Vice, Wax Poetics, and the LA Weekly. And Bill Kopp got his professional start writing for Trouser Press, then became editor of a national music magazine. He launched his site MusoScribe in 2009 and still publishes new content there every day. His work has appeared in Prague, Record Collector, Goldmine, where he's a contributing editor, Living Blues, SF Weekly, and many other outlets. He also does liner notes for album reissues and co-produced a reissue of Cannonball Adderley's final album. And his first book, Reinventing Pink Floyd, came out in 2018. As always, during their conversation, please post your questions as you think of them in the chat sidebar. And in the last part of the session, Eric will use them to call on you for the Q&A. And of course, we also encourage you to use the chat for comments and conversation. However, we'll ask the presenters to ignore the chat during your own discussion. Unlike in some virtual classrooms, we prefer to save the interactive part for the Q&A. And we'll send you a copy of the chat transcript later so you won't miss any of the comments. And now I'm very happy to turn things over to Jessica and Bill.
Hi, Bill.
Hi, thanks for having us. This is a treat. Jessica and I discussed a little bit ahead of time and decided what we would do, since a lot of what both of our latest books involve was interviewing, to interview each other. So after making the point that I'm really enjoying Jessica's book, because I've just, to me, it's fascinating to read about people starting an indie label, which is such a different mindset from the major labels. It's often, almost always, more about passion for the music than any kind of revenue, which is handy because a lot of times there really isn't much in the way of revenue for indie labels. Sometimes there is. But anyway, Jessica, I'm going to just throw some questions at you, okay?
That's great. I'd love to introduce my book to start, perhaps.
Please do that.
Which I casually have right here. So my book is It Ain't Retro, Daptone Records in the 21st Century Soul Revolution. It's a bio of Daptone Records, which is a Brooklyn-based independent label, and I argue one of the most important recording houses in a generation. In addition to supplying studio musicians for the likes of Amy Winehouse, Bruno Mars, Lady Gaga, and many Mark Ronson productions, the label's own acts, Sharon Jones and the Dap Kings, who we heard at the top of the session, Charles Bradley, Anti Ballas, and many others are legends in their own right. And the label's output of 60s and 70s style funk and soul had an incredible effect on this burgeoning international community of roots music fans, and I believe started a renaissance. So the book is a look back at the label's 20-year history, and this year is their 20th anniversary, and a study of the scene that it helped inspire.
What was the original inspiration for the book, besides liking the music?
Well, I've loved soul music for as long as I can remember. I grew up listening to a lot of oldies radio in the San Francisco Bay Area, and started writing about music in high school and then never really stopped. When I eventually came into this community of record collectors, musicians, and DJs, and people invested in soul-related subcultures, I wanted to dig deeper. So fast forward some years to this event called the Funky Soul Weekender in Los Angeles, and I was in the middle of complaining to a musician friend about how editors at major publications never wanted to pay attention to like retro soul bands. And he asked me if I had plans to write something longer than an article. And I was like, you mean a book? And he said, yeah. And I said, I would write about all of this, which was the scene that we were enjoying. So I went home that night and started voice dictating an outline for the book detailing the broader funk and soul revival. It turns out that was both too broad and too niche for most publishers, even academic ones. So about a year and a half in, I decided to pivot. Daptone was always going to be a major character in the book, but I decided to focus on their contributions to the scene at large.
So how long did the entire project take you from concept to completion?
From concept to seeing it on the shelf, 3 years, though most of the writing was done during the pandemic or during lockdown specifically.
Backing up a little bit, what did it feel like when you first discovered the music of Sharon Jones and the Dap Kings, the most well-known group on the label?
Well, it was a while ago, so I can't remember if it felt like a bomb had gone off or if there was like this relief that here was this thing that I had been wanting my whole life, like a contemporary band playing in this style that I grew up listening to. And it actually existed. So it sounds cheesy, but it blew my world wide open. And this particular moment happened when I was doing a late night radio show at a San Francisco community station called KUSF, and was digging through our stacks when I pulled out a Sharon Jones and the Dap Kings record, and it had this older feel, but it didn't look familiar. And when I put it on, it was just and I hadn't had that feeling previously.
I'm interested in the title. When you say it ain't retro, what do you mean specifically by that?
Well, this music gets sort of categorized as retro soul, and I might use that phrase to explain it to a more lay audience, but to say that this music in contemporary soul is retro would mean that the large scene, and it truly is international, is simply a throwback, and they're not doing anything new, and it's not relevant. Daptone Records, as well as its predecessor Desco, which operated from 1995 to about 2000, and the current crop of soul artists are iterating on these 60s and 70s sounds in soul and funk and even smaller subgenres there. They're proving that this tradition is living and evolving and catchy. One of Daptone's musicians, the drummer Homer Steinweiss, told me that he considers what they do to be continuing a folk tradition, which I thought was kind of an interesting way to think about it. A lot of the folks at Daptone are also very anti-establishment. They never cared whether or not the music they put out made money or if it appealed to popular tastes. They're punks, and they also felt pigeonholed and demeaned by the term retro. It's this bastardization too of a Sharon Jones quote. People would say like her music is retro, and she would say, "There's nothing about retro, nothing retro about me. I am soul." And I always thought that was pretty powerful.
From my own experience, both Desco and Daptone, they're sort of the production aesthetic that they use. I wouldn't necessarily call it retro. I'd think of it more as timeless. The fact that they tend to all often record in the same room as opposed to doing the flying in overdubs, kind of that thing. I mean, it creates a feel that, I mean, call it retro if you want, but it's an epithet. It's not a good, it does an injustice to it, to pigeonhole it that way.
Yeah, I think so too.
How do you think the Daptone fits into the larger narrative of indie record labels and soul music? Two-part question.
Well, I think that Daptone proves that independent labels are responsible for not only some of the most creative music, but they can have a profound effect on pop and mainstream art as well. In reporting this, I was blown away by the amount of pop studio sessions that Daptone Records and its musicians did, from the most famous Amy Winehouse. The Dap Kings, who were their house band, were the backing band for the majority of Back to Black. And I think the reason why that record, or one of the reasons why that record sounds so good. They've worked with Adele, Sturgill Simpson, Booker T. And so many hip hop artists have also sampled their music. Their instrumental group, Menahan Street Band, is a particular favorite, and it was sampled, or they were sampled by Jay-Z, Eminem, and Kanye West, among other people. I think too, Daptone as an indie label helped make soul popular again. They preceded Leon Bridges' early work and more recently Silk Sonic. I can't imagine that album would exist without the power of the soul revolution, and in particular, the more like sweet stuff that's going on right now. Even Adele's new album has like remnants of this. The tune Cry Your Heart Out has this early 60s girl group vibe. And I would think that Daptone also has an effect on that. Some of their musicians played on her earlier records as well. So I think that the style is sort of like crept through the ether. But on a smaller scale, and specifically in soul music, Daptone is perhaps the most important recording house in contemporary expressions of soul and funk. They're a modern wrecking crew or a contemporary version of Stax. And although there are a number of similar groups throughout the country and internationally, Daptone is by far the most successful and really helped pave the way for labels like Coal Mine Records in Ohio, instrumental funk groups like the True Loves in Seattle, and ultra small press shops like F-Stop Records. And to your point earlier, I think their championing of vinyl records and analog production is also something a decade well ahead of its time, and now a bit more commonplace in bigger studios.
It seems that with them, both Desco and Daptone sort of operating, at least initially, from outside the commercial sphere or removed from concerns about commercial things. It's all the more remarkable that they've ended up having influence on the commercial sphere, while that I would imagine wasn't really part of their master plan to the extent that they had one.
Yeah, totally not. And I think depending on who you talk to, they would say that they haven't had that influence. The co-founder, Gabe Roth, is very wary of discussing like their pop appeal and would believe that, you know, Amy Winehouse didn't beget them new fans or, you know, anything like that. I disagree, obviously, but I think that they are so focused and fiercely loyal to these sounds that they love, that they never planned on having such pop appeal and don't really care. For example, the platinum record that they have for the Back to Black album is Above the Toilet in their studio, the only place that they had.
I have a process question because this always fascinates me with book projects or any other large scale creative project. It looks like you interviewed about 36 people or so for the book. Is that about right?
Yeah.
So did you have a narrative framework or outline? I know you talked about how it did change, but did you have a narrative framework for how the story would evolve when you started the interviews, or is that something that revealed itself to you through the content of the interviews that you did?
I think it was a bit of a combination of both. I can't stress the importance of good outline enough, especially for me, and especially when you're doing so many interviews and slotting, you know, people in. But I wanted to tell the story chronologically. and felt that because there were so many voices in here, and it is a story of people working hard over time, and really for generations, that would be the best way to do it. So I did develop this outline, knew who the major players would be, and really started by using my knowledge as a fan to figure out what the high points were. And then when people would tell me stories or whatever, I would slot those in too.
How important do you think it is to, when doing a book like this, to have the perspective of a fan, as opposed, to bring that perspective to the project?
I mean, I would think it's invaluable. That this music is really heartfelt, and it's done by people who are passionate about it. So to look at it from somebody who's perhaps just a journalist or just an academic, but not really, personally or emotionally invested, I think means that it lacks a bit of the soul necessary to tell the story. And also a lot of the people that are involved, like there's a huge community of folks that are involved in this, not just the label, but collectors and promoters and fans and other such things. And I think that their stories are important to tell too. Maybe you wouldn't be as inclined to share those stories if you were looking at it from a bit of a more removed perspective.
What was the most challenging part of the project for you?
Well, certainly selling it, as I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with. I thought it was a really important story, but a lot of other people didn't feel like it was quite a fit, especially when I was pitching this as a scene study. Everyone was like, that's cool, but it's not really a thing, or I don't get it, but I like Charles Bradley. I think that was a big challenge. And then also trying to hold down all of the stories, because as I said, there are so many people involved. There was quite a bit of, well, I want to be in it, but I wasn't in it. Where is my name? A lot of respect wanting to be paid. And it's not an oral history. So finding a way to tell this story in a holistic way was a challenge.
In what ways did the pandemic affect the project?
Well, I was very fortunate to secure a book deal like right before lockdown. So I feel very thankful for that. The pandemic provided a lot of structure for my writing. I had lost my job right beforehand and said, well, I guess now this is the time that I'm going to do all of these things. So there was that. And fortunately and unfortunately, many of the musicians I still needed to interview were grounded from touring, much more available than they otherwise would have been.
I think your audio cut out. Can try saying something else.
Can you hear me now? No. What just happened? Anything? Yeah.
Okay. Seems like it's working now.
Sorry about that. So I don't know what the last thing I was able to hear was, but or you were able to hear, but I was saying that a lot of the musicians I needed to interview were sort of grounded from touring and more available for phone calls.
You created a Spotify playlist to accompany the book. And I know you have a background in marketing, so I'd like to know how important you think that is to the promotional mix to the book.
I'm honestly not sure how important it is, but I do feel that it's a bonus ad when selling a book about music. I also DJ and enjoy making mixes, so that was right up my alley. I used the playlist when I was pitching my book to agents and publishers and in pitches to press. At various book release events, I printed out little QR codes for the playlist so people could scan it. Not everyone is a deep fan of or super knowledgeable about soul, so I hope that would give them a jump start. Though I think what's more important than the playlist is direct sales. I found people were more likely to buy books when I did in-person events as part of merch. I've also been trying to place it in record stores, and record stores are more likely to buy from you if you have the book. right there to give to them, as opposed to having to go through a distributor, which I have.
And what advice might you give if someone asked if they were contemplating a project of a similar size, scope, nature? Really outline. I think that, anytime we're passionate about something, there's so much to say, and being able to sort of narrow it down for a good pitch, for good marketing, and to have something that's organizationally sound is really important. And aside from the promotion you're doing for this book, what's your next big project?
I'm working on a few different lengthy artist profiles and features. My next big piece is going to be a profile of this 30-year-old New York ska and rocksteady band called the Slackers for the Washington Post, which will be out hopefully in a couple of days.
Washington Post, wow, cool. Well, thank you. Like I said, I'm really enjoying the book. It's very, very well put together.
I appreciate that. Thank you for the thoughtful questions, Bill. I really dug them. Let me pull up my questions for you.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So,
should I introduce? Should I?
Yes, you should.
I'll take a second and sort of explain. What I'm going to do is I have a very short reading. It's the very, very short opening chapter. The book is called Disturbing the Peace, 415 Records and the Rise of New Wave. In 1989, the radical leftist industrial hip hop collective Consolidated reached its debut EP. The second track on that EP, How We Livin', features an audio snippet of a voicemail message. The speaker is Howard Howie Klein, who at the time of the EP's release was in his early 40s and a music industry bigwig. At the time, he was president of Reprise Warner Brothers Records. The thematic center of gravity of the track, How We Livin', is Klein's rhetorical question, quote, if music is just inspired by a desire to make money, how interesting could it really be? And that quote could have well served as the rallying cry for San Francisco-based 415 Records. Launched in 1978, the independent label would champion new wave, and to a more limited extent, punk, coming out of the Bay Area and beyond. Measured in strictly commercial terms, 415 Records was at best a modest success. But then for Klein and his founding partner, Chris Knab, who was also owner of the city's Aquarius Records, financial gain was never the primary goal. Ask him about it and Howie will tell you, fun, he'll say. It was all about fun. But 415 Records would have a lasting impact, one that extended far beyond the minor chart action that a few of the label's artists achieved. Klein and his cohorts established new ways of doing business in the music industry and were at the forefront of a resurgence of independent labels. Even today, in an era when the very idea of signing with a major label, with a label, is viewed by music acts as moribund or irrelevant, the guerrilla marketing tactics of 415 Records, including relationship marketing before such a term entered the business lexicon, can serve as a useful example to artists who are reaching for some level of success. And in a time when the instant access afforded by the internet was a concept too out there to even conceive, 415 Records helped promote artists through old-fashioned hard work and this is critical, a deep and abiding appreciation for the music. Consolidated didn't stumble upon the message from Howie Klein by accident. While the lineup of that collective, one which continues to this present day, would shift constantly, guitarist and founding member Adam Sherburne had previously been the frontman in a band called Until December, one of the bands that was on 415 Records back in the 80s. And at the time of releasing How We Livin', Consolidated also counted among its members Jimmy Dixon. Just a few years earlier, then teenage Dixon was a member of the 415 Records team, working closely with Howie Klein. Like a jigsaw puzzle, the individual pieces of 415 Records' story fit together to display the larger narrative. Today, only a handful of bands, and this was indeed an era and scene dominated by bands, not solo acts, from the 415 stable are still together or active in any form. Many of the individuals have long since gone on to other endeavors inside or outside of music, but nearly always pursuing a creative path. Some have retired. A few have passed on. Most, though, have vivid memories of their experiences with Howie Klein and 415 Records. Many years have passed, and the memories of those involved may do differ on a few of the finer points. But this is the book is their story, and the story of 415, the label whose official motto was "Disturbing the Peace."
Awesome. Bill, I've really been enjoying your book too, and it has all of the exciting history and scene setting that I enjoy when learning about a subculture or any sort of musical history. So it's really wonderful, particularly to read about my hometown. And I'm curious, I know you're calling in from North Carolina, but are you from San Francisco? And what inspired you to write the book?
I am not from San Francisco. I do a lot of freelance writing for music publications and alt weeklies. And in October of last year, a label called Liberation Hall, which is run by a couple of the people who used to run Rhino Records, began a series of reissues. And those reissues were early 415 releases back when the label was an indie, not affiliated with Columbia, which would come later. When I found out about that, I pitched a story to my editor at SF Weekly, and he was interested. So I wrote a story, and I did about a half dozen interviews. That story came out in SF Weekly's return to print issue, which was the Thanksgiving issue of last year. Sadly, they've since ceased publication, but we won't get into that. In doing those 6 interviews, I realized, one, that the story of 415 was much, much bigger, and that I was really only able to scratch the surface in a 1,000-word piece. And 2, because the focus of that SF Weekly piece was upon the indie period, it didn't even discuss some of my favorite bands that were kind of the soundtrack of my college years, Wire Train, Romeo Void, Translator, bands like that. So I did some pitching and got a publishing deal in December of last year, and then waited for the holidays to be over, and then started scheduling interviews in January.
So I'm curious how 415 Records disturbed the peace and helped define the sound of the San Francisco punk scene.
There was a thriving new wave and punk and then new wave scene in San Francisco, largely centered in the North Beach part of town. There were a number of clubs, Mabuhay Gardens being one of the main ones. And as one of my interviews said, several people that I talked to would say that you could pretty much go club hopping from one to another to another to another on foot in an evening and take in all different kinds of music. One person I interviewed called it a mall of entertainment. And these were local unsigned bands, and they were given a voice initially by Howie Klein and Chris Knab through radio shows that they were doing on a number of local freeform stations. And this was, you gotta remember, this was in the era when the whole Lee Abrams sort of formatting everything really, really tightly on radio playlists was beginning to happen. And so for a show to be freeform and the DJs actually decide what they want to play, that can't be overstated. The other thing that was interesting is because these bands were unsigned, it's not like they had professional demo tapes. A lot of times it was kind of, you'd set the recorder with a single mic in the center of the room and just record it, and you'd have this crappy cassette. The thing is, Howie and Chris would play those cassettes on the radio, and they what they discovered is they were tapping into an existing audience that was ready and very, very interested in this stuff. And as it turned out, the next logical step for them was to start a record label. And that's what they did.
Amazing. I really love those early scenes where you're taking us through North Beach, hopping around to different clubs with different members, really puts us there. And as you were saying, at its inception, 415 had, really tapped into a nascent but pretty prolific punk culture. How do you think 415 fits into the larger narrative of punk music and indie labels at large?
Well, in terms of indie labels, taking the second part first, in terms of indie labels, I think they're as I mentioned in reading from the introduction, some of the guerrilla marketing tactics that they used, certainly in the late 70s, were somewhat unusual. That was not a typical way. It was certainly not the way things were done in the record business. One of the interesting things that I learned about Howie Klein, and I had several people tell me this story, and it was one of the few times when different people's stories would all sort of line up. But the man has a photographic memory. He would talk to a program director at a college radio station in a college town in the Midwest, and he'd take notes and remember things. So he would remember the names of their kids, and how's your son? I know your son started college. How's that going? Different things like that. So he really was doing relationship marketing when that wasn't really, when that was still a fairly radical thing to do. In terms of punk and new wave, I think it just had more to do with the fact that because 415 was having some success and it attracted the attention of the majors, all of the majors. They only connected with one, but they were talking to pretty much all of them. It basically showed the majors that, hey, there is actually a market for this sort of weird outsider kind of music. And, I think that was important, leading to a number of bands, both on 415 and beyond, getting established and getting record deals.
I think the structure of centering the co-founder Howie Klein in the narrative as this main enigmatic character, followed by separate chapters on 415 bands, is really interesting. Can you tell me about the thought process behind that structure?
Well, I knew I wanted to cover the history of the label, from how Howie and Chris how they met up, how they got involved in starting to release records, and how the label grew and how it eventually connected with Columbia. Because, that was the other thing I was going to mention. 415 can also serve as an object lesson in kind of what not to do in terms of affiliating oneself with the majors. Because it was not a happy marriage, we'll say. But, I lost my train of thought. Oh, yes, the narrative, right. So, but then on top of the narrative of Howie and Chris and the label, there were also 28 or 29 bands to address. Some of them only released one song on a compilation record. Some of them only released a single. A few released EPs. And then at the other end of the scale, you had some that did 3-4 albums and more material like that. So what I ended up doing, the structure did kind of suggest itself to me after I did the interviews. In the first 3 months of this year, I did all 96 interviews. And then in the next 3 months, I wrote it. And so when I was doing all that, I had an outline where I would apportion how much content would go to each artist, each band, and where everything would fit in the narrative. But I had to tweak that a lot. Certain things like, these things really need to be combined. These things need to be split apart. And so in the end, the artists that did multiple albums, each album gets a chapter. and then some where they maybe only did a single for 415, like The Nuns, featuring a very young Alejandro Escobedo. They get a fair amount of coverage because they were the first and one of the more interesting. So it evolved over time, but I think the way I did it was, to me, the only way that made sense in terms of structure.
96 interviews is a lot. I see some faces here when you said that number, a lot of eyes widened. And the fact that you did that mostly, it seems, over this past year is pretty incredible. Where are you at in the publishing process right now?
There were 96 interviews in 90 days. And between the beginning of January and the end of March. I think once I started writing, I did have a couple stragglers, a couple people who I was able to get in touch with who I hadn't been able to. So wrote the book in the second quarter, turned it in. Also, thanks to a number of collectors, fans, and the artists themselves, I put together an archive of 750 images, 300 of which ended up in the book, many in color, some in black and white. I mean, set lists, concert posters, unpublished photos, professional photos, snapshots, all kinds of things, buttons, just stuff like that. The second half of the year has been, I've been working with my publisher, Hozak Publishing in Chicago, to get everything laid out and to make sure that it's also going to be coming out in the ebook version, which is something that Hozak hasn't done with its earlier publications, but that's something I really wanted them to be able to do. Because of all the interesting supply chain and logistics challenges that we're facing, the book, which was supposed to be out in December, I've been telling people late December. Now it's looking like early January. And by early, I mean like the 25th. So, you know, it's pushing out a little bit, but it will be out very, very soon.
I suppose that is one big challenge that you're facing. And I too had some pandemic related challenges. And my book got pushed only a couple of weeks, but was there a challenging part of this project and a way that you overcame it?
The challenge, I guess, would say reconciling the Rashomon effect. When you talk to multiple people about a given episode or historical happening or something like that, and sometimes the pieces don't all fit together. And again, like you said, you're not writing an oral history. You can do that. You can say, this person said this person said this, and you don't even have to comment on it. You just leave it there for the reader to go, well, this person seems credible, this one doesn't. Mine is a narrative, loads and loads of quotes, but it's a narrative. So trying to find a way that gets to the larger truth in a way that honors all of the people who contributed their recollections of it. It was a challenge, but I think I was able to pull it off. There was one case where there was some material that I was not able to corroborate anyway at all. And I eventually, because once as the structure began to morph a little bit, I discovered that to my delight, it didn't really fit into the book anyway. So I left that stuff out.
Great. If you had to recommend 3 groups from 415 Records that put out albums or singles, who would you pick?
Only 3 out of 28 or 29. That's tough.
A real hard question.
Yes, Rocky Erickson, who is quite well known, not so much for his involvement for 415. He's known for his work with the 13th Floor Elevators. But as it happens, from my perspective, the best thing he ever did, Elevators or Beyond, was an album called The Evil One, which was released on 415. So that's one. Another is Translator, the band that had a minor hit single in the early 80s called Everywhere That I'm Not. their fourth album, Evening of the Harvest, is a classic from my perspective, produced by Ed Stasium, who did a lot of great work for a lot of other people. And then Wire Train, who were sort of a heartland Americana, well, not really Americana, but proto-Americana sort of band. But their second album has hints of things like Brian Eno and Robert Fripp working their way into in fact, to me, they almost sound, there's some sounds on that second album, Between Two Words, that presage the kind of things that we'd hear a decade and a half later on Radiohead's OK Computer. And it's a bit of an outlier in their catalog, but I think it's their finest work. So Rocky Erickson, Translator, Wire Train.
I think that speaks to the diversity of San Francisco punk scene, new wave scene too.
Oh yeah, you had ska bands, you had all kinds of things. It was all over the map.
Are you working on anything else that you would like to plug besides your forthcoming book in early January?
Nothing I'd like to plug right now. I mean, I just finished a story on sort of an I'm not writing from an academic standpoint, but I interviewed some academics about Metallica for a piece that's going to run in SF Standard sometime in the next couple of weeks. I've got pieces on both the DBs and Let's Active, two North Carolina bands, coming out in upcoming issues of Record Collector. And I've got 3, maybe 4 book ideas rattling around in my head. Just, you know, all I need is a publisher, right? You know, yeah. So.
Excellent. Cool. Well, I'm really looking forward to having the book in my hands.
Me too.
I'm sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, should I open it up to Q&A a little bit at this point?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And thanks, you guys. That was an enormously generous way you both approached this. I don't think we've ever had quite as much of an engaged one person interviewing than the other person interviewing back process before. So that was a real model and a fascinating way to do it.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm just trying to be Bill's 100th interview for this book.
That's right. If you're not careful, it'll end up being the epilogue. So
too late now.
So we've got a couple of questions already in hand. I've got a question to ask, and I'll encourage others to just let us know if you'd like to ask one. So Antonia, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. Thank you both for this overview of these 2 books about the indie labels. My question, I guess, was for Jessica about the idea of retro soul music. Essentially, I was asking if the audience for soul music has changed over time. When I think of Leon Bridges, one reason I think about him being retro is because the audience for his music has changed, and for the Dap Kings seems to have changed. And so in that sense, I think you can make an argument that soul music ended, I don't know, in the 70s, I don't know, you know, and that the new music is retro in the sense that the audiences are different. So Black in one time, and then Black and white, but, you know, or originating in Black musics and less so, and the audience is certainly less so today.
Sure. I would say that the Black audience for this particular kind of soul music is certainly smaller today and 10 years ago than it was, when the music was originally coming out. I mean, that said, Berry Gordy was making, this amazing, beautiful, very catchy soul to be consumed by Black audiences and white audiences, because that's where he was going to get, a lot of airplay, and, goes without saying that that's a complicated issue and complicated time. I think that Daptone throughout its run has been, primarily, white folks, people who are kind of like NPR listeners. They got a lot of play early on from community radio stations, lots of positive press from, indie blogs and things. The issue of race has been certainly something that came up in reporting, but no one really wanted to touch on too much. These are bands that are, mixed race, but are primarily white, fronted by Black people. And the audiences don't exactly also kind of reflect that. So Leon Bridges, for example, was a really interesting example, because when he came out, he's singing this sort of like pre-civil rights era soul, and got a lot of flack for the fact that he, you know, in a post like Black Lives Matter world, was sort of singing this apolitical music. And I think that there is a bit of, I know there's a lot of mixed feelings around like whether or not this music needs to be for particular audiences, whether it needs to say something, or if it can just be good and groovy. Actually, that I will say though, in the past maybe like 5 to 10 years, you've seen a wider diversity of people who are like invested in this scene. I can think of several bands that you know, have a majority of members of color, or you know, there's a huge burgeoning like Chicano soul scene right now too. Thank you for that question.
I think Carl, you were up next.
Yeah, this is a smaller question, but it definitely came up while Jessica was talking earlier, and I was just struck by it. You know, I mean, I think for any label situation, but particularly for indie labels, the idea of having a house band feels like a kind of radical departure, and not something that's ever really been part of that model so much. So I'm curious whether Daptone had that idea from the first, or how that evolved, and when they came to see that it was a resource that could maybe help financially float things and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, you know, it started off as like just a group of close musicians who were gigging in different styles and different bands together. And they did that for about, you know, 4 or 5 years during the disco days. And I think this music breeds a particular kind of like passion and nerddom and fandom that it, you know, when you find somebody who's like you, who's into the same things, you stick together. So over the years, that just sort of developed into this cohort of players who might not be the most virtuosic, but really understood the style that they were trying to do, how to play to a whole. And over time, they just got really tight and became the studio group for many, many bands. And some of them would play, you know, in different versions of, or different configurations and different sounds. Like the Dap Kings, half of them are also in Antibalas, for example. A quarter of them are also in Menahan Street Band. And as a result, they're also developed this core crew that is now Mark Ronson's go-to guys for a lot of soul and funk.
And so was Ronson part of this world in some way, in that, like, how did they connect, or were they deliberately trying to find producers that they could work as studio people with? Or
not at all, not at all. They'd had like a couple small gigs, like small studio gigs, but Mark Ronson was living in New York, was DJing. You know, they're in opposite worlds, but you know, musicians get around. And supposedly Dave Guy, a trumpet player who's now a member of the Roots, connected with Mark Ronson and gave him a copy, a cover that the Dap Kings did of Signed, Sealed, Delivered. And Mark Ronson was working with Amy Winehouse at the time to try to come up with a new concept for her second album, which would be Back to Black. And wanted it to sound a bit older, and said he was doing every studio trick in the book to try to give it this feel, but nothing was working. He shows her this demo, and it really just struck a chord with both of them. So they finished working on the label. She flies back home to the UK, and he makes an appointment on Troutman Street with Gabe Roth, the co-founder of Daptone Records. So they actually recorded the majority of that while she was away, and just using tracks in the headphones.
Cool. Lucretia, let's bring you in.
Thank you all for this. I love that interview format. And also, I always get so emotional when I come to these events. And the reason this one made me emotional in a good way is I just feel like this punk rock DIY outside the mainstream. It's just so good to be reminded that there are groups of people, collectives, music labels, musicians, just people like us just trying to do stuff that they believe in that's outside the mainstream, even if it gets popular. So thank you. That means just so much to me. So my question is like 2 questions about the writing process. Both of you did a ton of interviews, and I'm just curious, like, how did you know what to leave in and what to leave out of your books? And then also, what was your daily writing practice like? Did you ever get overwhelmed? Was it happy? Like, how did it go?
Bill, do you want to take that one?
Oh, you want me to go first? Okay. Let's see. So I remember the second part of the question was about the daily writing process. I just did it, just cranked it out. What was so interesting about after, the question about what to leave in, what to leave out. I've used this phrase before, but the material really suggested the whole story to me. I'll take Translator, the band Translator, for example. I interviewed all 4 members about their entire career, from how they started as musicians as kids, to how the band got together, to all their releases and their dealings with 415, and interviewing them individually, not all in a group chat or anything. When I got it all done and looked back over my transcripts, for them, there was probably maybe 8 or 9 hours of transcripts just from the 4 of them. Reading over that, I looked at it and it's like, oh, okay. It was a story, and it was just a matter of, as I started putting it together, here's an idea, here's an assertion from one of them, and here's something supporting from another of them that really fleshes that out and adds into your understanding of it. And so it just flowed. It was magical. It was beyond, it wasn't something that I cleverly wove these stories together. They mystically, magically fit together. I can't explain it, but it happened, and I'm thrilled that it did.
That's cool.
I agree that the material sort of presents itself as story worthy. I put together a timeline of important releases and events, and then weave that together with Gabe Roth's story, him being the main character, I think, among all of the many characters, and then try to figure out like who else can help support it and build the world. And there are definitely people that I wish I would have interviewed, looking back, and maybe if I ever have to do a second edition, I could write them in. But there's so many people, it's really difficult. In terms of writing process, I am often one of those writers that hates writing, loves having written. And during the pandemic, I was feeling like I had all of this time and really needed to just give myself some structure. I'm a night writer, so I leaned into writing like from 8, but really from like 10 or so until 2 in the morning, and then would go to sleep, wake up at 10 a.m. and like do it all over again, and usually try to conduct interviews in the morning when I don't have to have the muse with me. Yeah.
Cool. All right, I'm going to ask a question to maybe wrap us up for today. It does involve a wild generalization, so if it's completely off base, just shoot me down. It seems to me that in a way, the difference between your 2 books is that one is about a moment where there was real thought that a commercial breakthrough was going to happen and it didn't quite. That would be the 415 new wave moment. And the other is about a story where at the beginning, it would have seemed ludicrous to think that there was a big commercial outcome. And yet at the end of the day, you just effortlessly name some of the biggest records of the last few years and connections to some of the biggest figures. So if you feel like taking a crack at it, I guess I would ask each of you why the expectations got flipped.
That's a really good question. I'm not sure. I mean, again, depending on who you would you would speak to in Daptone specifically, they don't necessarily believe that they are successes. Like, you know, Gabe Roth is making money in royalties, has a nice house, has lots of, you know, production work, but he's just a guy and is very very nonchalant, very nonplussed about the success. And I think that they just like were, I don't know. Actually, I feel like I need to think about this a little bit more.
I'll tell you what, let's bring Bill in for a little bit, and then if you want to add more on the other side, go for it. Bill, you want to take a shot at this?
I think that Howie Klein and Chris Knab, you know, they, as I mentioned, they didn't really approach the entire enterprise from the standpoint of, like, hey, here's how we're going to make some money. But as things progressed, because this was such a small scene, I mean, in some ways, I really got the vibe talking to all these people that San Francisco of the late 70s and early 80s had kind of a small, the music scene had a little bit of a small town, close-knit feeling to it. These people were friends. And so Howie and Chris wanted their friends to be successful. And so they, at some point, they realized, you know, it's fine for us to do this without the idea that we're trying to be commercially successful. But if we want these bands who are now getting some measure of success, you're starting to tour, if we want them to have any kind of tour support, you know, if we don't want them to travel in the back of a pickup truck with a gem top on the back and a ratty mattress, then we're going to have major label support. So they went for that major label support. What they found is that it was not what they had hoped for, and it was not what they expected. It was antithetical in almost every way, because the approach of Columbia was, we're going to throw not a bunch, but some money at you, and you're going to produce right now a hit. And if you don't, we don't want to know. We're not interested anymore, you know. And so then they would just not drop them from the label, but they would just ignore them completely. And so that, you know, some of these bands, every one of the major bands that was part of the Columbia era, 415, broke up before the end of the 415 Columbia era. And so some of them, I mean, Red Rockers had a pretty big MTV hit with China. Romeo Void had a pretty big hit with Never Say Never, and then later A Girl in Trouble. But they never quite made it to that next level. And I think part of it is because they had that indie mindset, which is a great thing for music, but it's not necessarily a great thing if you're trying to shift a bunch of units.
Okay, thank you. And then let me take it back to Jessica with that. So that's the classic story one always hears. Major labels screw everything up, and hopes and dreams are dashed. Your crew seemed to sort of keep the indie label mindset, but be part of gigantic selling albums.
Mm-hmm. And I think that it just goes to show that they had really good taste all along. Like, they never cared if they were going to sell lots of units, but everyone was very passionate about these genres and had an incredible set of performers to back up. I mean, to see Sharon Jones live is insane. Like, she is a woman in her 50s who has this unbridled energy, who had cancer and came back from it and was even stronger, faster, more passionate. And I think that really translated. It translates into album sales, into ticket sales, and it also resonates with, you know, other musicians and fans. So even though they might not have charting singles, they were selling out like 10,000 venue arenas or 10,000 seat arenas, and you know, helping develop a scene that was international. And I think that they've really ensconced themselves in the canon of soul music, and it's a little bit more attainable too than somebody like Gladys Knight or like Aretha Franklin, who are a generation removed, and you know, you probably aren't going to see them, and not in the same raw way. I mean, especially in their earlier shows, I would say that Sharon Jones and the Dap Kings, Charles Bradley, they have the same kind of punk energy that some of the 415 artists would have.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Bill. Terrific session. I just want to let people know, on the other side of the holidays, we will resume the series with 3 books on maverick country music of the Tammy Wynette, women in contemporary Nashville, and the story of queer country. So thanks for this evening. I'm going to pause the recording, and thanks again.